Oh, good morning. My name is Karen Hosking. I'm the CEO of Sanfilippo Children's Foundation. Thank you all very much for being here. I'm delighted to welcome you to the 2024 Solving Sanfilippo Symposium, including everybody who's joining us online today. So today we gather on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and I, alongside with the Samri community who work within this beautiful facility, would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the Kaurna people as the traditional custodians of the Adelaide region. I acknowledge the deep connections and relationship of the Kaurna people to the Adelaide region, to this country. I pay respect to their ancestors, past, present and emerging leaders, along with any First Nations people who are joining us today or online. As we all know, sovereignty has never been ceded, and this was, is and always will be Aboriginal land. I have a lot of people to thank, so just bear with me. To Cedric Barty and the team here at SAMRI, Ella, Paris, Alejandra and Serena, and to Michael from SAMRI Venue Management, thank you very much for hosting us again. We could not do this without your assistance, so thank you. I'd also like to acknowledge the tireless efforts of my team, especially Danny and Dr. Lisa Melton, for pulling together this year's symposium. The lineup of speakers and topics is phenomenal. I'd like to say a very special thank you also to our planning committee, who helped to shape today's program in collaboration with Danny and Lisa. So to Kim Hemsley, Michael Chan, Sidi Mukabara, Sidi, after all that, I stumbled over it anyway, Mubaraka, Jan Caslin, Cedric Barty, and our family representative, Teresa Lloyd, who's also here with us today. So thank you all very much. Also like to make special thanks to Michael Lidelli and his team at the University of Adelaide, and also to Carissa Barthelson from Flinders, who are going to host a family tour tomorrow at their facility of the zebrafish and fruit fly facilities, which is really exciting, and for the families to see how they contribute to the knowledge base in Sanfilippo. And there's a very special person in the room I'd like to thank, Heather Parkinson, who has made some amazing quilts for our families to take home with them as a gift at the end of the symposium. They are at the back. They're absolutely beautiful. Heather, we're very, very grateful for you and your kindness. It's beautiful, so thank you very much. It is wonderful to see so many families in the room with us today, and there are many more joining us online. Thank you all for being here. I appreciate it's not always easy to get away for events like this. I'd also like to pay a special thanks to Rohan Tifal and the CommBank Staff Foundation for supporting families to be here and take part in these important discussions. So last year, the foundation marked its 10th anniversary. As we reached this milestone, we took a really long, hard look at the impact that we'd made in driving research over our first decade to help guide our way forward to accelerate impact for families. We analysed our internal data, we surveyed our funded researchers to examine the extent and nature of our support for research against what we had set out to achieve. Our priority has always been to drive high quality research that will halt progression of Sanfilippo, help to repair damage and improve quality of life, as well as to help drive translation of discoveries into treatments, build capacity in the research community and foster collaboration. A high-level summary of our impact report is available on our website, and I would encourage you to have a read of this. I will share a link at the end of this. But I would just like to highlight a couple of the key findings from this impact evaluation. So over the past decade, we've directed over 7.5 million into promising research. At the 10-year point, this translated and represented support for 41 projects and initiatives, including 30 competitive research grants, a clinical trial that gave Australian patients access to an emerging therapy, our flagship Brain in a Dish project, which you will hear some about later today, scholarships and a number of other initiatives. Through our grants, we've been able to help enable the successful recruitment and retention of researchers into Sanfilippo research, including many early career researchers and some from other fields. And I'm absolutely delighted that some of these talented researchers are presenting over the next 2 days. 2/3 of the projects that we funded investigated therapeutic candidates, and at the time we published, all but one continued to be pursued in the preclinical phases of research. So the projects that we have supported have generated powerful shareable resources that will continue to drive progress in Sanfilippo research. It was 22 research tools, assays or protocols, 3 data sets, and 36 biological resources like cells and animal models and counting. And collaboration has really been a universal theme over the past decade. The Global Research Roadmap and Clinical Care Consensus Guidelines were mammoth collaborative projects and so vitally important to setting priorities for the research community, but also for optimising clinical care for individuals with Sanfilippo. In addition, collaboration is reflected in the way that we co-fund with international partners, enable and support multidisciplinary projects, and forging new connections and collaborations through symposiums like this. And I hope these 2 days really spark some new ideas, some new conversations, and opportunities to partner that will take research further even faster. We're very proud of the contributions that we have made to date in driving the field of Sanfilippo research forward, both in Australia and globally. Today, I feel we have a vibrant, diverse and growing research community. We have a growing pool of research tools and resources, and we have a large number of therapeutic candidates in development. However, there's still a lot of work to be done. And the findings from our evaluation, along with the priorities of the global roadmap, are informing a current review of our research strategy to ensure that we are able to really drive research forward to genuinely meet the needs of families as quickly as possible. And speaking of collaboration, I'm going to give you a very brief overview of something that we're immensely proud of, and that's the establishment of the International Sanfilippo Syndrome Alliance, or ISA, and I will refer to it as ISA from now on. I'm just going to give you a quick summary of how we came to be, who we are, and our priorities as an alliance. So some of you may have heard about ISA earlier this year, but basically we're a global alliance of dedicated Sanfilippo patient organisations from around the world, and we're all working together to solve Sanfilippo syndrome. And Sanfilippo Children's Foundation acts as the secretariat for ISA. We officially launched in February this year, and the organisations listed on this slide are the founding members. There's 11 from 10 countries, and we all have a long history of working together in collaboration. So you can see the countries represented here are from South America, Europe, and the US. I think, though, it's really important to recognise that the Sanfilippo community has a very long and enduring track record in collaboration and coming together to support each other. And this collaboration predates our foundation, with many parent-led trailblazers coming before us to shine a light on the unmet needs of individuals with Sanfilippo. And it's only off the back of that collaboration and foundational work that we've been able to build such momentum and establish ISA. So in the world of rare disease, we face the very big, very real challenges of scarcity of resources, limited research capacity, and access to patients and knowledge. And all of our members recognise that none of us can work in isolation. It's inefficient, it's unaffordable, and it's completely unfair to all of our families who need urgent solutions. As we all know, Sanfilippo is a devastating diagnosis and it does move quickly. So collectively, we all believe we have a moral imperative to break down any silos that exist, willingly share knowledge, ideas and resources, and find ways forward that genuinely deliver solutions for families as quickly as possible. So in the recent years, ISA members have worked together in lots of different ways. So I've mentioned before, the two most significant collaborations have been to produce the global research roadmap for Sanfilippo therapies and the clinical care consensus guidelines. Funding promising research is core business for most of us, and members have co-funded projects around the world, including here in Australia. So it's against this backdrop that ISA was formalised, establishing a platform for us to collectively progress a global advocacy and action agenda that's aligned with our shared priorities. And ISA really is about facilitating the sharing of resources and information. It's about supporting one another. It's working together in advocacy on issues that affect families around the world, driving forward research and hopefully accelerating access to treatment. ISA is guided by a set of principles, values and priorities, and the values in which we have established the Alliance really centre around trust, openness and transparency, our willingness to share, being agile and responsive, and building consensus. This foundation also acknowledges the importance of autonomy, but the potential of collective impact and what we can achieve together. So we are a new alliance. There's still a lot of work to be done in terms of our governance and in terms of our future membership structure. But one day we hope to have even more global representation across our member base. The priorities that we have include providing mutual support as we each pursue local, national, international activities and research endeavours. But through this collaboration, we can quickly identify opportunities to unify our voices on issues with global implications. So treatment access, screening programs that will help address the problem of missed or delayed diagnosis, projects and initiatives that can help establish benchmarks and potentially be scaled up globally. The global roadmap, which was developed through very widespread consultation and building consensus on what needs to be done to solve Sanfilippo, has helped enormously to really define and guide our priorities. And ISA provides that platform to, really efficiently drive those key enablers and priorities forward as quickly as possible, including building research infrastructure and networks to benefit everyone in the Sanfilippo field. This is some of our initial activities. So the global roadmap has now been translated into several languages, and members are collectively and individually driving forward the implementation of many of the pillars and enablers that are needed to achieve the aims of the roadmap. Making the clinical care consensus guidelines accessible to families and clinical teams around the world is really a significant step forward towards improving the quality of care, achieving the best possible outcomes for individuals with Sanfilippo. We're all waving the flag for this and doing what we can to raise the awareness of the availability, make sure that these are actually embedded into clinical practice. Working together to amplify advocacy for drug development programs. We know the history of drug developments falling at the last hurdle in the rare disease space and in Sanfilippo indeed. We recognise that the actions of international regulators like the FDA have implications for the whole global community. So we are very embedded in unifying our voices to speak out on this issue and try and influence those decisions by key regulators. And data initiatives like data sharing and a patient registry are two key roadmap enablers that we are all working on together. We commissioned a feasibility study for a Sanfilippo patient registry, and Lisa will present on this later today. So there's two final things I'd like to touch on that have far-reaching implications for the Sanfilippo community at the current time. The first is expansion of Australia's newborn blood spot screening program. Newborn screening, it's been a hot topic at the last couple of symposiums, and we have a panel discussion later today to go through some more issues as well. But last year, some of you may be aware of this, but the Minister for Health actually referred a list of conditions to the Federal Department of Health for what was called technical assessment for potential inclusion on the newborn screening program. Sanfilippo syndrome was on this list. The department has completed its technical assessment of Sanfilippo and has referred this now to the Health Ministers' meeting, which is the collective federal and state and territory health ministers from around Australia, to make a decision on whether Sanfilippo will actually proceed to assessment by the Medical Services Advisory Committee, or MSAC, which is now the new approval pathway for conditions to be included on newborn screening. We provided some evidence to the department to help inform its technical assessment, and we're very hopeful that Sanfilippo will get the green light to at least continue on that approval pathway to MSAC, because that gives us an opportunity to really contribute the evidence, the family perspective, and help to, inform that decision in the most productive way. There's still a long way to go to be fully approved, but we all know early diagnosis is really critical for children, and it gives parents not only choice, but options and the many benefits of early intervention for improving outcomes for their child. I really hope through today's panel discussion that we can identify some of those key areas where structures and resources need to be in place to support families receiving an early diagnosis and to help focus us collectively on the next steps. The second topic I'd like to touch on is the current discussions in the US about validating heparan sulfate as a biomarker in neuronopathic MPS disorders like Sanfilippo and facilitating access to the FDA's accelerated approval pathway. If you haven't watched it already, the workshop that was held in February by the Reagan O'Dell Foundation for the FDA on qualifying biomarkers to support rare disease regulatory pathways actually used heparan sulfate as the case study in this full-day workshop. All of the transcripts and presentations are online, and I would encourage you to go and have a look at this if you haven't already. We really hope that this is a watershed moment for Sanfilippo. That workshop brought together patient organisations, it brought together scientists and researchers and clinicians, and it brought together the FDA decision makers. And it was very, very compelling. And the evidence was compelling. And, I think it's fair to say that the consensus at the end of the day is that heparan sulfate should be considered as a biomarker, but there's still a way to go to get that validated and qualified by regulators. Access to the FDA's accelerated approval pathway for, the very promising gene therapies and ERTs that are coming through and are at the pointy end of the process is an absolute game changer. We're keeping a very close eye on the progress in this space and advocating through ISA and in our own right to really ensure that the family voice is front and centre of decision making. And lastly, before I introduce Sarah, I just would like to say we're absolutely thrilled to have so many parents and carers joining us in the room and online. This is a scientific meeting, so I was just encourage anybody presenting to be mindful of the scientific jargon and try and also researchers who may not be from the same scientific specialty as you. So just to be mindful of that and try and translate where you can, where it's appropriate. I'm going to introduce Sarah Beatty-Stevens, who's going to talk about her beautiful son, Callum, and what it's like living with Sanfilippo and sort of set the scene for the next 2 days. So Sarah, please come up and join me.
Living with Sanfilippo can make your world really, really small. Small in a lot of ways you might expect, and small in so many other ways that you could never imagine. I think it's the experience of any new parent that with the entry of your precious newborn into this world, it inevitably makes your world a bit smaller, at least for a little while. You take your baby home to nurture and love and care for as you find your feet and settle into a new routine. And then you begin to branch out again, feeling safe and secure to expand the experience of your newborn and begin opening up their world. Often with Sanfilippo babies, that early experience of your world shrinking and then quickly opening up again is pretty typical, and there's nothing to alert you to the fact that yours and your child's experience is not going to end up like everybody else's. My Callum was an enormous baby. He was a completely unexpected 4.2 kilos and had to be delivered by emergency cesarean and then was rushed to the NICU after needing resuscitation in the operating theater. His stay in the hospital was a little longer than expected, but after 7 days, I brought him home and prepared to settle into what I expected to be a normal first-time parent experience. In many ways it was, but not in the ways that I had hoped. He didn't sleep at all. He had trouble breastfeeding. Everything felt more difficult, and I found myself wondering why Callum's challenges seemed a bit more difficult to resolve than the other babies in my mother's group and wider social circle. In those early stages, people are endlessly supportive because every new parent struggles at least some of the time. But within that first year, I found myself already retreating to the safety of our home. As other moms endlessly bonded over all the amazing things their children were doing, my experience was already falling outside of the norm, and it was difficult to relate and feel a part of the group when Callum seemed to be different. As the weeks and months went on, I found myself and Callum falling further behind, slowly and subtly at first, but then definitively and noticeably. Callum didn't play the same way that other babies did, and he didn't engage with me the same way that other babies engaged with their moms. At a year old, he began childcare and he got sick, just like every other kid. It was a typical respiratory illness characterized by congestion and a cough. Except, unlike every other kid, Callum never recovered. The cough came and went, he was more fatigued than ever, and the congestion never cleared up. Because of this, Callum missed many, many days of childcare due to his visible symptoms of illness, and I found myself fielding fewer and fewer phone calls and invitations from the mums group for coffees and catch-ups. We often declined invites because of his symptoms, and I think over time people just stopped extending the invites because we could never say yes without the caveat of, yes, but only if Callum's feeling better. Within those first few years, I found myself feeling like my support network was diminishing as other mums were flourishing. COVID hit the world just after Callum's second birthday. And if I thought that constant congestion and a runny nose was a huge problem before, it became the problem for us post-March of 2020. Even if I wanted to take Callum out, living in Victoria during COVID meant that our already small and diminishing world became unbelievably small. Literally the 4 walls of our home and maybe the 5-kilometer radius around our house when the Melbourne winter weather would allow it. It was around that time that I knew definitely there was something about Callum's development that was not typical, and I threw myself into full investigative mode. When the lockdowns were lifted and other people were enjoying the freedoms of family reunions and outings into the city, social gatherings of all descriptions. I was relentlessly calling any and all providers of face-to-face autism and developmental delay assessment clinics, begging for appointments in what I knew would be the short window before the next lockdown. We filled our weeks of freedom with face-to-face speech therapy consultations, pediatrician appointments, and intake appointments for behavioral therapy, occupational therapy, and physiotherapy. Everyone's world became smaller during COVID, but as a parent navigating the healthcare system and fighting for answers for my child's unexplainable developmental delays and medical issues, mine became even smaller. When weeks and months would go by between visits with my friends and his peers, it became ever apparent that something was happening to my little man that was preventing him from experiencing the wider world and everything it had to offer. I waited over a year for his autism diagnosis, over a year to have his adenoids removed and grommets put in his ears. These were fixes that medical professionals told us would resolve his speech and developmental issues. But after waiting for what felt like a lifetime for these resolutions, Callum's divergences from normal didn't improve. As a parent of a child who doesn't follow the normal developmental pathway, life becomes very lonely very quickly. Other parents were already putting their children into sports, activities, and considering what schools to send them to based on early inclinations towards math, sciences, or athletics. I couldn't participate or relate to any of this. I spent all of my time ruminating over the next step, the next assessment, the next diagnostic pathway that might help me understand what was happening to Callum. No one understood, no one could offer any advice, and people seemed to be losing patience with my constant battle with the healthcare system that couldn't provide the answers I was looking for. When his pediatrician finally asked me about his autism diagnosis, and I told her that I thought it was crap, she said, "Good, let's keep investigating." She ordered an array of blood work, imaging, and urine screening as the next step. Finally, I thought, someone who can expand our world beyond this constant autism rhetoric and hopefully into something more meaningful. For most people, a diagnosis is freedom. It provides answers, clarity, a direction to follow. It opens up treatment options, clinical pathways, medications, support groups, access to specialist physicians with advice and answers to cure a treatment or to cure the ailment. A diagnosis can open up a world of opportunity and hope. A Sanfilippo diagnosis offers none of these things. When it comes to discussing the next steps, options, treatments, or supports, we as parents often are offered nothing but a shrug of the shoulders, shaking of heads, and a sad look across the doctors' faces as they tell us to go home and love and enjoy our children with whatever time we have left. If you ever imagined what it's like to have your world close in on you, for this big, wide world to become smaller than you ever imagined, this is how it happens. You receive a Sanfilippo diagnosis for your child. When your child has a terminal illness, everything stops. Just like those first few days with a newborn, you take your child home to love and care for them, but you're also forced to process this devastating news. Unlike the newborn stage, the world doesn't feel full of opportunity. It doesn't feel big and endless and welcoming. It closes down, shuts you in, and at every turn reminds you that your child's life is not the norm, it's challenging, and it's limited. I'm really proud to be able to say that the parents of children with Sanfilippo are some of the strongest that I've ever known. And not even a terminal diagnosis will stop us from getting out and making sure that our children fill their short lives with adventure and excitement. But the other parents in the room will understand the mental anguish we experience before we even leave the house to do anything or go anywhere. And sometimes it just makes things too hard. There is literally nowhere in the public domain that is dignified, safe, or clean where you can change the nappy of a large child who needs to be properly cleaned up. You have to be prepared to have eyes and hands on your child literally every second you are out because they have no fear and no concept of danger. You can't hold a conversation, enjoy a meal, or even finish a coffee because you're constantly keeping your child engaged or grabbing them so they don't run into traffic. Without their speech, they can't tell you what they're feeling or what they need. As their mobility regresses, they fall, trip, and bump themselves constantly. You Google every venue, every park, every possible place you might take them to figure out if it's going to be safe and appropriate for your child, whether it's going to be over or understimulating. Some things become completely impossible. Long-haul international flights to North America for Callum to see his grandparents, cousins, and extended family are now just not possible at all. And then there's the emotional toll of having to explain Sanfilippo syndrome to confused strangers. There's the deep sadness of watching your child at the playground playing alone because they do not understand how to play with their peers because their brain damage is so advanced. There's the heaviness and persistent stress of waking up and falling asleep every night knowing that your child will lose everything, including their life, to a relentless and incurable disease. Life with a child with Sanfilippo can become increasingly and overwhelmingly impossible. And so when your world becomes smaller and smaller, it almost doesn't matter anymore. At home, nobody looks at your child with questions in their eyes. Nobody pulls back when your child grabs them unexpectedly. Nobody looks at you with pity and shakes their head when you have to explain that your child has a form of childhood dementia. At this symposium last year, I met Professor Cedric Barty, a neurobiologist who is an internationally recognized leader in the field of human neural stem cells and single-cell genetics. We were getting to know each other after the first day of presentations, and he asked about Callum. I told him how difficult it was day to day, feeling so alone and like nobody understood what our family was going through. How difficult it was that family and friends had become distant. How sometimes I felt resentful that other people were able to continue their lives and not be constantly burdened by Sanfilippo. How small our world had become in the year since Callum's diagnosis. He said to me, "I know how difficult it is to have to think about Sanfilippo every day, and I want you to know that I think about it every day too." For the first time since Callum's diagnosis, in this very room, I remember feeling like our world began to open up again. I remember looking around the room and realizing that everyone there, just like everyone here today, all of the scientists, the academics, the medical professionals, the politicians, and the staff of the foundation were all thinking about Sanfilippo every day, just like I am. For the first time since Callum's diagnosis, I felt like there was hope for our children. I felt an overwhelming gratitude for all of the incredible people who were making it their life's work to contribute to finding a cure. For the people who were passionate about their science that I might never understand, but that might one day lead to treatments and even a cure for Sanfilippo children. The world that had felt so closed for Callum, the world that had felt unforgiving and inaccessible and unwelcoming, was suddenly so much brighter and filled with so much more hope with the knowledge that this brilliant community of people was dedicating their lives to saving Callum's. I didn't feel alone anymore, and I knew I didn't have to fight every battle on my own. I knew that behind the scenes in your labs and your offices, your collaborative work with colleagues and physicians, and even with the politicians and policymakers, you are passionately working to open up the world for my son and the other Sanfilippo children. You're fighting with me, and you're fighting for Callum, and I didn't know it then, but I know it now. So I want to thank you all for your contributions, and especially for the time you've taken over the next few days to be here with us. Through all of your work, you're giving us so much hope. A hope for treatment, a hope for a cure, a hope for a future for our children, a hope that their world will be as bright and full of opportunity as it would have been if we were never living with Sanfilippo. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Really sets the scene for why we're here and what we're aiming to do over the next couple of days. And we really appreciate you sharing your story and understand how difficult that is for you and for all of us. Okay, we're now going to move into the next session. I'm Lisa Melton. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Head of Research at Sanfilippo Children's Foundation, and I'm going to chair this next session. We're going to take a look at prevention and diagnosis of Sanfilippo syndrome and related conditions. I'll now introduce Dr. Carol Su. Carol is a biochemical genetic pathologist at SA Pathology in the Women's and Children's Hospital in Adelaide, where all of the newborn blood spot screening cards from across South Australia, Tasmania, and the Northern Territory are analysed. Her research has been translated into diagnostic services, including to assist families who have lost a child due to sudden arrhythmic death syndrome. And she is the clinical lead for the Genomic Newborn Screening Project, Newborns in SA, which is led by Associate Professor Karen Kassan, who's also here with us in the room. Carol, I will hand over to you to tell us about your work.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And I would like to thank the Sanfilippo Children's Foundation for the opportunity to speak today. So I'm presenting on behalf of our study team, Newborn in SA, to talk about genomic NBS and the criteria and considerations for the inclusion of the conditions. So we're talking about newborn screening today, which is an example of what a successful population program can deliver. And the aim is to provide early detection on serious condition for prompt treatment and better outcome. Dr. Robert Guffey, the father of newborn screening, developed the first blood spot assay for PKU in 1960s. Since then, a simple blood test at birth has meant that thousands of children have avoided lifelong disability or death from a range of conditions. So, the newborn screening in South Australia, it has been started also in 1960. It is a very successful program with high coverage. More than 99% of babies born in this state are screened every year. The newborn screening is performed in the SA Pathology Laboratory located in Women's and Children's Hospital with the coverage of 3 states, South Australia, Tasmania, and the Lower Northern Territories. So currently the list of target conditions screened is over 30. So at policy level, newborn screening has a national policy framework endorsed by the Australian Health Ministers Advisory Council in 2017. So the framework provides several guiding principles, stressing the environment of delivering NBS is changing. National approaches are needed to support the program, and any future developments should focus on conditions, and screening must remain high quality, safe, and family focused. And one of the important groundwork this framework has outlined is a policy of a national decision-making process to add condition in the newborn screening with defined pathway and criteria. So the federal government has been greatly involved in the newborn screening in the recent few years since 2022, with funding allocated to achieve national consistency on the newborn blood spot screening, as well as to expand the programs. So since then, we have a national list of screening conditions has been agreed that is published in the Commonwealth website, as well as a number of additional conditions has been through for technical advice and health technology assessments. So it is still constantly progressing. And for the national decision-making pathway, it also has been published on the Department of Health website. The aim is to do it on a regular basis to identify new conditions for consideration to include in the newborn screening. So it will, after the conditions are identified, it will go through technical and implementation advice by expert groups, which will be provided to the health ministers for consideration. And the next step is to go through the health technology assessments by the MSEC. And finally, the approval will be sorted from the health ministers to endorse for the implementation. So looking at the current policy and landscape of the newborn screening, expansion, it is what we want to achieve. So genomic sequencing is an important technology we would consider because it has transformed the landscape in diagnostic setting already, provided rapid, accurate, and cost-effective diagnosis. So the next step, the newborn screening community is thinking it is incorporating genomic sequencing at population scale in NBS, which will hold the promise of substantially expanding the early detection of treatable rare diseases. A number of studies are aiming to sequence a genome of thousands of neonates launched worldwide in the United States, Europe, and Australia. And the cohort size range from 1,000 to 100,000 newborns, and the number of the conditions included range from about 126 to about 1,000. So the program design is quite diverse existingly. So in Australia, we have 5 projects that are funded by the Australian Genomic Health Future Mission. That is to collectively explore how genomics can be incorporated with the newborn screening program. And Newborn in SA is one of the 5 projects, and there are 2 other projects, Baby Screen and EpiGen in the Victoria, and 1 project in the Newborn Gen Seek Trail in the New South Wales. And the project of interest that is related to the talk today is the genomics for newborns. So this is the study which will examine the Australian stakeholders' view on the ethical, legal, equity implications of genomic newborn screenings, as well as looking at how they are integrated into the assessment of effectiveness and cost effectiveness. And ultimately, we would want to know what are the suitable assessment criteria should be used to assess these aspects, and are they acceptable to the policymakers? And extending to the ethical consideration of the genomic NBS, we should think about it at 2 levels. Firstly, it's about the individual. Genomic screening will result in both increase in the breadth of the different conditions as well as the overall number of cases identified. So, we will expect this to improve the health and physical well-being. At the same time, we should also consider the negative impact on the well-being if a family is receiving an abnormal result, particularly if they are with uncertainty. So in this aspect, the families need to be supported. And next thing we need to consider is autonomy in informed consent, which is increasingly important given that the complexity of the testing involved in the genomic NBS. At a society level, and it is crucial to ensure privacy and data protection of genetic information with strict data management strategies to develop safe, secure data storage and sharing. This will be the key to maintain the public confidence on the screening. The health and economic consideration, the rational and responsible expenditure of healthcare is paramount to the society. So we should look at the overall health cost effectiveness of the newborn screening, plus taking into account of all the associated costs around the screening, including the pre-test provision testing itself, any follow-up testing and treatment. And last but not least, equity. It is the key success for implementing the screening, because the how the newborn screening is successful because of the high coverage, and also the equity also applies to the access to the treatment, which will be a key principle in guiding decisions about what conditions to include in genomic NBS. So once we have patients identified in the screening, we want all of them have equitable access to all the interventions they need. So our Newborn in SA project has used the Baby Screen Plus gene panel that is developed, available on the Australian panel app. And then for the eligibility criteria for conditions to include genomic NBS, screening programs are using the Wilson and Younger classic criteria as a backbone, as a guiding principle. And in our the gene panel we use, the genes were assessed in the following criteria. First, it is the disease severity. We aim at include disease that causes significant morbidity and mortality. And next is the available effective treatment. So we aim at have include the disease that have the treatment that can alter the natural course of disease by the means of medication, diet supplement or enzyme replacement therapy, transplantation or gene therapy. And then the disease onset for the genes, we looking at the childhood onset that is less than 5 years of age. for the disease onsets. And we also want to, we also would like to also select the gene with definite analytical validity. That means this variant spectrum is currently readily detectable by the whole genome sequencing pipeline. We also select the genes with known clinical validity, which means the gene-disease relationship is well established from the literature or some reliable resources. Change, yes, the next slide. So the baby screen plus gene is as compared with published genes from 5 other genomic NBS projects to determine a consensus genes and identify areas of discrepancy. So surprisingly, the results showed that GNBS genes are actually highly variable. There's little consensus across the studies. The core list of the genes included in all 6 GNBS studies only have 55 genes, and most of the GNBS has significant number of unique genes as well. And the most common group of genes that are those associated with metabolic condition, immunodeficiency, followed by the endocrine and the endocrine disorder. So why the situation is so complex? What are the challenges I have for making these decisions? So there are a number of factors. First is variable definition of treatability. Whether you include the genes that only have a complete curative treatment that can give the child for a normal life, or you will select the genes that have treatment partially reduce the morbidity, or only have treatment available of some of the clinical features, but not all of them. Or some would set a threshold if the condition identified, we have some supportive therapy to improve the outcome. We already include. So given that spectrum, the gene selection will be diverse. The next factor, it is the variable access of the treatment in different jurisdictions. An example is Duchenne muscular dystrophy. The treatment is not available in all the countries. So whether to include this in your healthcare system will depend on whether the drug is available. And then one of the assessment is about the strength of disease gene association. And so on the literature, there are a very long list of genes, and each of them would have their own report about how the disease is associated phenotype and how many families has been identified, and then the co-segregation, and then what line you draw to say that this gene is associated with that particular disease. Different project group would have a different threshold. And then the gene disease onset age, we aim at early childhood condition, but how early or how late the childhood you will identify? Do you aim at only first 3 or 5 years, or some of the project it is looking at into the treatment at the late childhood at age of 8 or 10? So the number of genes included would be different because of this reason as well. The genomic NBS is still a rapidly emerging area, and then the opinions from the different professional groups as well as topic are diverse. So we are in a way to gather all the evidence to make a way forward how this can be implemented in the population. And then we also need to think about the workforce challenges and involving the implementation, because the GNBS is opening a whole framework of the screening, both from the provision of the testing capacity, as well as the clinical follow-up care needs to be ready to take care of the patient that is identified through the screening. And then the last point I want to address is technical challenges, because not all the genes are equal on the sequencing. Some genes have high homology, render them the variant detection is difficult on the whole genome sequencing. And some of the disease, their common variants are not detectable by the pipeline as well. This is a quick slide showing the technical challenges we would have encountered. On the this side is the STRC gene, which is a technical challenging gene that would have, and then the upper panel is showing the coverage of the gene, which is all in the red line, means they have reduced expected coverage. And the lower panel, we can see most of the area are filled up with the non-solid line. That means we don't have enough sequencing data to accurately read the area on this gene. And the one on the right, it is to give an example what a satisfactory data should look like. It is the coverage which the green line on the expected threshold, and all the area is filled by the solid line. That means we got reliable sequencing read. So N-glu will be a gene suitable to be used in the whole genome sequencing, while this STLC it is not. And as the decision is so complex, there's a number of algorithm has been developed to more objectively assess and measure the actionability of conditions to include in the NBS. So how they work out, it is in a similar model. It is to divide the score in different category with a number scoring system. And then the category, it is mainly about the severity of the disease, likelihood of the symptoms, the treatment efficacy, acceptability, and the current knowledge of the disease. So with this scoring system, hopefully it would be they will be useful to make a systematic assessment about the conditions to be included in the genomic NBS. So what are the public views in Australia? There are 2 papers to examine this aspect, and they have reported a very high support of genomic NBS from the public. It is 77%. And in the public's view, they also recognize the need to prioritize the condition for inclusion and the criteria that we discussed just now, like the age of onset, likelihood of the condition, severity, etc. Also the reasonable and sensible in the public's point of view. And then during the study, it has shown that fully publicly funded GMBS is highly advocated, and then the public perception about the benefits of early diagnosis and intervention is also very high. The challenges are also recognized by the public. It is what is the impact of the genomic NBS will be on parents, with the complex testing to be too overwhelming or unnecessary alarming to the new parents. And if the results are uncertain, would they affect the emotional attachment of the child? And also the data security, discrimination, etc. that is associated with the use of the genetic data. So last bit, going back to our study, we have completed our retrospective cohort validation study and entered the phase of prospective study to recruit at risk and unwell newborns entering the metabolomic and genomic screening. We are also developing the parameters for clinical and cost effectiveness in our health economic arms. And this is the gene list we have in the new one in assay that will be circulated to our clinical collaborators. Currently, we have 613 genes, and the core is based on the baby plus gene panel with 605 green genes with high evidence to be included in newborn screening. It includes Sanfilippo B and glue gene. And then we have 8 genes of interest that are curated by our local assay clinical team. And in this list, we have included Sanfilippo A, the SGSH gene. So that's what I'd like to share with you today. I would like to take the opportunity to acknowledge our investigative team with the metabolomic and genomic scientists from assay pathology and the clinical specialists in the Women's and Children's Hospital, and my appreciation to our partner. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you. Is this on? Yeah. Thank you very much, Carol. That was a really interesting presentation. We'll take 1 or 2 very quick questions. Again, trying to claw back a little bit of time so we can get to our interesting discussion panel shortly. Any pressing questions for Dr. Su? Anything online? Yes, Kim?
Thanks very much for a beautiful presentation. Just a quick question about the number of people who were supportive of the screening. You had, I think it was 23% who weren't for a variety of reasons. Do you think that can be overcome with increased education, or is there always going to be a certain percentage, and is that the percentage that is not going to want to enter in any sort of screening?
I think definitely the number will go up because based on the study and the other 23% is being unsure rather opposing the genomic newborn screening. There are minimal opinion that is objecting the implementation of the GMBS. But I mean, the study is involved 75 individuals. It is not a huge group. I think at a population level, when we look at the vaccination, there will be a small percentage of people would object the public health measure. We can't achieve a 0%, but I'm confident that it will be overwhelming support. It's over 95%, because the whole exercise, it is ongoing already. We have newborn screening. It's doing very little harm for the population, and the good that we can achieve is demonstrated to be overwhelming since 1960. And then I think the genome MBS will have potential to upscale the benefits to a broader spectrum of disease. I think that's very obvious, and I agree from different communities.
We'll press on and introduce Professor Michael Gelb, who is joining us from Seattle. Professor Gelb is there, I hope. Professor Gelb is the Boris and Barbara L. Weinstein Endowed Chair in Chemistry at the University of Washington. He's an international leader in the field of newborn blood spot screening technologies, and his outstanding contributions to the field have been recognized in multiple awards, including most recently the 2023 Robert Guthrie Award from the International Society for Neonatal Screening. He collaborates with Professor Maria Fuller, our local expert in diagnosis of MPS disorders, and her team here at SA Pathology. And he's worked very closely with Maria on this research, which he's going to present to us today about the diagnosis of multiple MPS disorders through newborn blood spot screening techniques. Professor Gelb, if you're there, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, let me start off by really rocking the boat here. So I'm a big fan of newborn sequencing, but I will say in its present configuration, it's going to fail for sure, and I'll just leave that for the discussion section, okay? That's a bold statement. Newborn screening for all MPS types, including MPS 3A and 3D. That's what I'm going to talk about today. Let's see. My disclosures, that's fine. Okay. Sorry, I'm going to be a bit blunt now. So Enzo Ranieri is going to get mad at me. But anyways, after talking to a few of my colleagues in Australia, I have learned that Australia seems to be stalled in starting to screen for lysosomal storage diseases, including, for example, MPS 1, for which we have well-established good treatments that are offered throughout Australia. There seems to be concern about false positives, but current data strongly suggests that false positives for newborn screening of MPSs will be extremely low. And this is all published. And the key is to use a second-tier test, as you'll see in this talk. There seems to be continued discussion about whether to do first-tier enzymatic activity or first-tier glycosaminoglycans, which I'll call GAGs. Let me try to resolve this in this talk. The answer is clear. Let's go, Australia. You offer and pay for the treatment of MPSs. Your healthcare system pays for these expensive treatments, yet you don't screen and catch the patients early when the treatment is more efficacious. So I really don't get it. It's as simple as that. But I think you're worried about false positives, but there isn't any false positives essentially. So I don't get it. So my goal today is to put you on the spot, to make you angry, even if you get angry at me. The hope is it will spark some movement. Good. Now, the punchlines. Newborn screening for all types of MPSs, including Sanfilippo type 3A and 3D, is feasible in a high-throughput newborn screening lab. It's proven, it's published. The technology is well developed and well tested. The precision is extremely high, essentially 0 false positives and false negatives. And I know you don't believe that, but it turns out we think it's true. Now you have two choices. You can measure the enzymatic activity of the relevant enzyme in the dried blood spot, followed by a second-tier analysis of the glycosaminoglycans in the same blood spot, or you can do the vice versa approach. And we've considered this in great detail. It's published last year. The first-tier enzyme and second-tier GAGs is the clear method of choice, as you'll see. And I know there's a lot of discussion in Australia about this. I think it's mostly political and historical and not scientific, but if you want the scientific version, it's in this paper. Okay, so first let's talk about the methods to measure GAGs, and this is where my 5-year collaboration with Maria Fuller and Adelaide has really been very fruitful. So there's 2 GAG methods in play. One is the classical internal disaccharide method, where the GAG polymers are degraded into disaccharides with bacterial enzymes, and These resultant GAG fragments are quantified by liquid chromatography tandem mass spec. Then there's the Fuller method, which I officially call the endogenous non-reducing end method. There's no GAG polymer digestion, rather short fragments from the so-called non-reducing end of the GAG are present endogenously in the sample. So you don't do anything. They're already there, floating around in the blood of the patient without any processing, and they're quantified by LC mass spec. It was developed by John Hopwood's lab. I think Enzo Ranieri was involved, Maria Fuller involved big time. She continues to run this assay for clinical diagnosis in Adelaide, and it's for urine, and we extended the method for analysis of dried blood spots because this is the only sample available for newborn screening. So my focus is always on newborn screening, not on diagnosis of sick kids. Okay. So let me show you that the Fuller method works massively better than the classical method. And let me say that the data is so convincing that essentially all serious players in this field have either converted to the Fuller method or are converting now. For example, the Mayo Clinic, which I think is the largest biochemical genetics lab in the world, they will be converting to this method in the next several months. So on the left, upper left, you see we took 182 random newborns, presumably healthy, and then we took MPS Sanfilippo 3A, MPS 3A type A newborn blood spots from already diagnosed patients. These are already clinically confirmed symptomatic patients. We went hard work. We go back to the newborn screening lab and we get their residual birth blood spot because we only care at birth what this looks like, right? It's irrelevant what it looks like in older kids for newborn screening. And you can see there's a lot of overlap between the classical marker for this marker. There's 3 different markers generated by the classical method, and there's massive overlap in all cases. You know, it works pretty well, but there's a lot of overlap. The Fuller method is the clear winner, okay? There's one marker, Fuller, and there's no overlap, okay. We go to 3B, it's the same story. Overlap, overlap, overlap. For the classical method, no overlap for the Fuller method. The data is black and white. It's night and day. MPS 3C, overlap, overlap, overlap. You can see my cursor, and here, here are the newborns. We only had 2 3C newborns, and well above the randoms. The MPS 3C from the older patients, some overlap. So I think the data is less compelling for 3C because it's so rare, but I think it looks pretty good. And then 3D, overlap, 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 clear separation. We could not get any newborn MPS 3D. It's too rare. So that, you know, we contacted all 5 patients in the National MPS Registry, and we asked for their newborn blood spots, and we couldn't get them, right? So that, we don't know where to get them. We don't know where the patients are, except if they're in the National MPS Society Registry. Anyways, the non-newborns are all well separated. Okay, good. So the endogenous NRE GAG method is the best method so far for GAG analysis, but it cannot be done, I believe, for first-tier newborn screening of MPSs. The method requires a mass spec system with extremely high sensitivity, I mean signal to noise, such as the very top end of a Waters instrument. These instruments are not typically available in newborn screening labs, and even if they were, you could not do hundreds of blood spots a day on this kind of machine and not run into trouble. You're at the very edge of what you can do, and this is not high volume assay. So if you're thinking about doing the Fuller method for first-tier newborn screening, you would have to prove to me that you can do it on, you know, on 500,000 samples a year in Australia, and I don't think you can, and I don't think Maria thinks you can either. So so the choices you have is you could do the enzyme first, and then the classical GAG method, and then the Fuller method on a tiny number of blood spots that emerge that have low enzyme. Or you could run the classical method first, which you can do because the signal is much higher. Remember, you're digesting the GAGs with enzyme, you're generating hundreds of copies of these markers per GAG polymer. The Fuller method only gives you one copy. So the classical method is about 100 times more abundant marker, but less informative. So you could do it first tier and then enzyme, or you could do enzyme first, followed by Fuller second tier. Okay, good. The key is you need, okay, so let's look at the difference. This is all in the paper. So it's much cheaper, apparently, to do the internal disaccharide method first. It's about 0.46 cents per newborn versus $6 for all the enzyme substrates. This is, let's say you do all the MPSs, all of them. The time for results is about the same. The false positive rate is massive for the internal disaccharide. It's about 13%. So 1 in 10 babies will have a false positive for an MPS. That's massive. The enzyme, it's 0.07%, right? It's, what is it? 200 times lower. But that's okay. So maybe you're willing to do 1 in 10, you do the enzyme second tier, but that's a lot of second tiers. Whereas, you know, this is 1 in a few thousand second tiers. The key for me is that the GAG methods require a separate set of LC mass spec instruments, whereas the enzyme assays can be multiplexed with many other things, as you'll see, 26 other diseases. So I don't believe that Australia is going, or anybody is going to set up first tier GAG analysis on a separate set of mass specs from the other set of mass specs that they would use for everything else. So in the end, the mass spec will be, the mass spec costs will increase, costs for the GAGs will overwhelm this difference in price here. So the decision to me is clear. It will be enzyme first tier. And if anybody disagrees, I'd be happy to debate them in person rather than disagreeing behind my back. I would appreciate that. Now, this is the 26-plex that we've published recently. And, you know, it includes all the MPSs. This is all the enzyme assays, all the LSDs that we screen for in the United States and other parts of the world, you know, Krabbe disease, Pompe, MPS1. It even includes GALT and biotinidase, which are done by fluorometric assays, but we're consolidating all these assays in several newborn screening labs in the United States now to make it much cheaper and faster. There's no point in doing separate fluorometric assays for GALT and biotinidase and then doing LSDs on mass spec. Do everything by mass spec. So anyways, this is up to 26 conditions and growing. Still can't get to 600 diseases that are included in your newborn sequencing panel, but that's another story. Now let me show you, we turned this loose on 250,000 samples in Ottawa, Canada. And this has yet to be published. We're close. And they did DNA, so they did enzyme first tier for MPS1, and then they did DNA. Okay, and what they found was they found a bunch of low enzymes that had pseudodeficiency mutations. They found low enzyme that were carriers, one pathogenic mutation. They found one patient that was confirmed clinically to have MPS1. They found 5 patients that low enzyme, and they had one pathogenic mutation and a VU. So this is absolutely inconclusive because we don't know what the VU means. So this is useless information, the DNA sequencing. They had 2 patients that were VU, and they had one patient that was pathogenic, likely pathogenic, and so this is the Fuller GAG marker on all of these patients. This is our severe MPS1 patients from my lab that I showed you in the previous slide. This is 2 cases we had of attenuated MPS1. You see they have lower GAG marker, but still well elevated. So all of the pseudodeficiencies, I would say, are MPS free. I think there's no chance they have MPS1. And the DNA left these families, all 20 of them, in high anxiety inconclusivity. The carriers, of course, aren't going to get MPS 1, and the data support that here. The confirmed case, we did not miss. The pathogenic VUS, inconclusive case, we would say probably these are all not going to develop MPS 1. The two of them a little bit elevated, but so far clinically they test no symptoms. So I would set these guys free. VUS, I would set them free. And the pathogenic, likely pathogenic, the DNA would suggest disease, and we confirm that. Okay, so this shows you how well this GAG method works on DNA, okay, compared to DNA. All right. MPS 3 pilot studies. We've published MPS 3B on 100,000 newborns. This was de-identified. It was published 5 years ago. We didn't find any cases based on low enzyme GAGs and DNA, but the false positive rate was very low. And then this is published. So then we start Screen Plus with Melissa Wasserstein in New York. This is the largest prospective pilot study in the world for new diseases. We're doing 14 diseases. We have the identity of the patients. If the patient tests positive, we can send them for treatment or clinical trials. And we're planning to add MPS 3A in the summer of this year because of the clinical trials. We were doing MPS 3B for a while, and I guess Melissa took that off because there's no clinical trials right now, and she refuses to identify a patient, tell the family, and then offer them no options. So if 3B options become available, we could add this back. Okay, here's the group. All right, so I'm done and happy to participate in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Michael. That was a whistle-stop tour of a very impressive technique. Okay, any very pressing questions for Michael before we move into the panel discussion? Just getting you a microphone.
Hey, how you going? I'm a parent of an MPS 3A, and obviously being a layperson, that was completely and utterly confusing. However, my question to you is, are you saying that heel pricks are not as effective as doing full bloods and urine screening? Yeah, that's just my question to you. Yeah,
no, we could screen, I think, perfectly for all the MPSs with a heel stick, biochemically. There's no issues that I can think of. I think the false positive rate will be essentially zero. What does essentially zero mean? We see. You saw the Canadian data for MPS 1. We had no false positives out of 200,000, so that is zero, essentially zero. For MPS 2, I would say we have the same degree of evidence. No, for the other MPS 3, 4, 6, 7, we don't have a ton of data, except to say that every time we take a patient that has this disease, you know, they always test positive with the GAG marker. So that tells us that we should not expect to see any false negatives. But, you know, we haven't tested tons of samples, but so far it looks good. As far as the false positives, you know, there isn't any because by the time we do enzymes and then second-tier GAGs, there's nothing left except the occasional true positive. So there isn't any false positives. Now you say there's always going to be false positives. Mike, come on. We know this from screening for 50 years. I don't know. I got to say, so far we don't see any. So, you know, these techniques weren't around 50 years ago. And all the fussiness about the false positives, I think it's not called for given the published literature. I'll just leave it at that. I think you're talking about old news.
Okay, thank you, Michael. I'm now going to introduce a few more individuals to this discussion. I hope that they are online and ready to go. Dr. Shanti Balasubramaniam is a metabolic geneticist at the Kids Research Institute and the Children's Hospital at Westmead in Sydney. Her research interests include the expansion of the newborn screening program and functional genomic technologies in mitochondrial disease and rare genetic diseases. We also have Professor Gustav Bhattacharya. He's a paediatrician trained in the UK who now works with the Sydney Children's Hospital Network. And he's performed scientific advisory roles for government and not-for-profits and works closely with the New South Wales Biochemical Genetics Laboratory and the state's newborn screening program. And we also have Enzo. I believe I saw him online before, ready to have a discussion with Michael. Enzo is Dr. Enzo Ranieri was previously the head of the newborn screening and biochemical genetics laboratory in South SA pathology, and he's currently. We have a little bit of interference there from someone's microphone. Enzo currently heads the newborn screening program in New South Wales, an expert on the methodologies of diagnostic testing and screening for MPS disorders. I hope we also have Edwin still online, and we've got Carol sitting lonely here on the stage. Thank you, Carol, for being our person in the room. So we might launch into a little bit of a discussion. I think Michael has raised some interesting arguments there that we can get into in a moment. I just wanted to sort of frame this discussion a little bit from the perspective of patients and families. In 2022, Sanfilippo Children's Foundation surveyed our parents in the Australian Sanfilippo family community who are known to the foundation, and on their attitudes to and perspectives on newborn screening. So we recognise that these families have already had experience of a severe disease diagnosis in their family and are different to the rest of the population. But it was interesting to note that all of the families were supportive of newborn screening for Sanfilippo syndrome being added to the schedule, even in the absence of a disease-modifying therapy. And their reasons given for this were that they can, as Edwin has talked about, that reproductive confidence for future children, the prevention of the years seeking a diagnosis, receiving misdiagnoses and given inappropriate therapies and so on, as we heard from Sarah at the beginning, and the possibility of identifying children while they're still within the therapeutic window, allowing them potentially to access clinical trials. Now, we recognise that there are lots of challenges, ethical, clinical and technical, to realising these hopes for newborn screening for Sanfilippo. So we want to sort of try and dive into some of that with you all this morning. So I wanted to come first of all to the discussion around reproductive confidence and perhaps bring Edwin back in there. In terms of where we're at with carrier screening and the timeline and challenges we have to overcome to access carrier screening in an equitable way, what is our likely sort of best chance scenario for providing reproductive confidence to families? Is it going to be really accelerating newborn screening and making sure that those children are picked up as early as possible, and that their parents then have the opportunity to make decisions around future children? Or are we really in the position where we can prevent a diagnosis of Sanfilippo in the first place through carrier screening? Edwin, perhaps throw that to you first.
Yeah, so I'd have to say talk of prevention is controversial in the carrier screening literature. And even though many of us may think of it in those terms, at least as part of our motivation, really the focus is on providing reproductive autonomy. And not everyone makes a decision to avoid having an affected child, even for a condition like Sanfilippo. I think that it needs to be both, not either or, because as I sort of mentioned, we have limitations in our ability to call variants in the absence of an affected individual. You can't do the kind of biochemical confirmation reliably. It's just not feasible. So there are going to be variants that we can't classify, and so couples that we can't advise that they have an increased chance. And then uptake is never going to be 100%. So there'll be people who don't access screening. So even if you had a national program, that wouldn't take away consideration of newborn screening. But I mean, obviously, my view is that it's better to have the information before you have an affected child. And so that's why I've got the focus on carrier screening. Unfortunately, even the best case scenario is that we're some years away from having a national screening program in Australia. That's just the reality of it. It's a huge enterprise setting something like that up. even assuming that we get the political support that will be required.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to sort of add to that in terms of the timelines that we are looking at in terms of newborn screening and/or carrier screening? No one wants to take that one. So also, are there ethical barriers to implementing newborn screening to help provide reproductive confidence? Carol, you touched on the Wilson and Younger criteria, which were developed in the 60s, 70s, I think, for making decisions around newborn screening or screening programs in general. And reproductive confidence, and those criteria really fall on the individual with the condition themselves and what happens to them. Reproductive confidence falls outside of that individual that's being tested in the blood spot to their extended family. What are the ethical considerations we need to think about, and how does that affect the newborn screening program in terms of consent and informed consent for families that are undertaking blood spot screening?
So for the newborn screening, the primary benefit is for the newborn baby, and then they are also because they are genetic disease, there will be extended benefit to the family. Because for like just cystic fibrosis, when the baby is picked up by the newborn screening, the parents will be picked up their carriers, so they are the extra benefit that could bring up in the newborn screening. But what the Wilson-Young criteria emphasizes is the benefits should be at the newborn period, and there is treatment available. And then the available treatment to benefit the newborn, I think it is the primary goal. We want to invest the public money to conduct the newborn screening. And for the parents, they are part of the clinical care pathway because they will be referred to the clinical genetics unit. Their reproductive options in the future would be addressed as well. So once the disease is picked up by the newborn screening. So in terms of the reproductive health, how it take into consideration with the public health screening program. That's why I think the reproductive screening and newborn screening, they are not mutually exclusive. So we don't think with the reproductive screening, we need to stop the newborn screening because we pick up on that stage. And there, Edwin has mentioned some limitation about the variant curation. When we don't have an affected individual, we can't name those disease causing. So they may reduce, but still will have number of patients that identify, they will manifest at the newborn, and that's come into the role of the newborn screening to pick up those individuals. And then while the Wilson-Young criteria are developed in sexy, I acknowledge that the field of all the technologies, disease management, treatment are rapidly changing. And what's applicable at the present might change the next week, next month, or next year, maybe a whole new world already. And then what we newborn screening to do is the decision making needs to be rapid. We need to appraise the latest evidence to apply on the newborn screening. Once we make the things ready, the test is ready, the clinical management pathway is ready, we can adopt a new disorder. I think that is best help to expand the screening in a most scientific evidence-based way. And also we also should think about research component of the newborn screening. Like some of the clinical trial, some of the disease are on a clinical trial and they have promising results. But if you put it at the government to ask them to fund the trial, fund something that is still on trial, might not be feasible. So there should be a bundle of the research should bundle up from the screening and the clinical trial should put together. Once screening detected disorder, the patient will be eligible for the clinical trial. That makes the equity on the access for the test and the treatment in terms of the clinical trial. That is what we want to achieve in the newborn screening, and that will benefit the clinical trial to pick up the patient at an early pre-symptomatic phase to show the efficacy of the treatment. So I think if we have such research going in parallel, that would enhance the power to show the scientific evidence how newborn screening can change the outcome of the patient affected by these diseases.
So if I understand you correctly, you're talking about a sort of a less rigid Younger and Wilson criteria assessment, a sort of more flexible approach to assessing each condition on its own merits, if that's the right word to use. And certainly when it comes to clinical trials. So are you suggesting that clinical trials or a pilot for newborn screening needs to go hand in hand with clinical trials? We've seen that happen with SMA very successfully, spinal muscular
Exactly. The SMA is a successful story to demonstrate that how we can bring a gene therapy to show efficacy and then bring it to the newborn screening. Yeah.
So what do we need to, what are there things that we need in place, and perhaps some of the clinicians can comment on this as well, to make those things go hand in hand, the newborn screening and the clinical trials? How do we make that? There was a lot of effort went into making that happen for spinal muscular atrophy. How can we do that in a more sort of routine way for conditions that need screening and have clinical trials? We know that clinical trials come and go, but what do we need to put in place to help that along? Perhaps Carol, you can comment on that, but perhaps Shanti and or Gustav can comment on that too.
So I really treasure the opportunity for the newborn screening, newborn in SA is the project we are going, and how can we realize, I think it's hard to say how we routinely establish it because they are all innovative. And then what we have, we are grateful to have, it is a team of the scientists and clinicians that are interested in the project as a backbone of the research team. And then we have the government MRFA funding to fund the project, and that allow us to employ research people and then use, I have the funding for the reagent and then partly for the instruments to do the groundwork for particular project. But I mean, it would take time, and also each project, the achievement might not would have a significant outcome. And then we probably, like Mackenzie mission, they need ongoing funding on the research to demonstrate the outcome on the next stage, so that we eventually can achieve as a public implementation.
Thank you. So it's a very large undertaking for each condition. Shanti or Gustav, you want to add to that? Shanti?
Yeah, I might. Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to this panel discussion. I just want to acknowledge that in Australia, we're actually really fortunate to have a fairly comprehensive newborn screening program, and we understand how successful population screening from a newborn perspective has worked internationally. And in Australia, more than 99% of our babies are screened, and this has resulted in more than 300,000 babies screened annually. And the success of the program really is reliant upon a very robust and transparent process of vetting through conditions. And we have historically abided by the Wilson and Younger criteria when we select conditions. And it has been an ad hoc basis in the past, but it's primarily been focused on the benefit of early diagnosis of conditions, the availability of a treatment option, balancing the harms, pros and cons of introducing a condition, and if there's a reliable test suitable for this. And as Michael has already explained, we do have tests available, first year enzyme assay followed by GAG's subspecies analysis. However, I might ask Michael offline, we don't have a commercial test kit available that includes MPS 3 with all the other MPSs multiplex, but I'll ask you off screen, offline, Michael, on that. Now, the success, as I said, is reliant upon this robust mechanism of vetting through conditions. However, internationally, there have been increasing calls to move further beyond the traditional aim of newborn screening, and including what would previously been identified as untreatable conditions, or where there are no amenable therapeutic avenues available. And we have to be cautious when clinical trials abound, just as Michael has mentioned. In New York, they had to remove 3B because once a clinical trial is over with a very limited recruitment number, then patients will be, provided the false expectation that that might translate to a therapeutic avenue available. So we have to be fairly cautious on taking on a condition, and we have to constantly monitor or surveil on the validity of inclusion of that particular test. Saying that, I just wanted to mention that, we are fortunate that the government has invested 64 million from 2022 to 3 up until 27 to 28 to support this expansion program. It has to be, however, conducted in a in a very comprehensive, structured manner. And for that, we have interjurisdictional committee that represents the health departments, that looks into the local policy development, operational issues, the opportunities that labs have, the technology, etc. And this is really important in making the tests available on a more equitable manner for all states and jurisdictions, because you might be aware that SME was started in New South Wales and there's this postcode lottery. So to make it more equitable, we have to have this constructive manner of working through the processes. And as you know, MPS 3 has walked through the pathway right from the Program Management Committee, and it's right now with the health ministers meeting, and then will subsequently be reviewed by the MSEC. So we'll have to wait and see what the outcomes are. Sorry, I'm not sure if I've helped answer your question, but I think I just wanted to acknowledge that we have a really good, robust, comprehensive reviewing mechanism for the inclusion of newborn screening conditions. Just wanting to ensure that we don't want to build false expectations if there are no therapeutic avenues. And that's why historically the Wilson and Younger criteria has really focused on conditions where there are interventions which are required, which are urgent. Not saying that supportive care is not important, but there are clinical algorithms like those proposed by Maria Escola's team and published in 2020, where neonates and infants can be monitored as part of their developmental assessments and identified based on clinical presentation. And of course, reproductive carrier screening as well. Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, no, thank you, Shanti. That was very helpful. I can see Enzo's keen to jump in, but Gustav, maybe just continuing with that clinical theme, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's very important, building upon what Sarah said earlier on, that who provides the news to the family who gets a positive newborn screen, how that is done, how that is managed, and how the care after that continues, I think is imperative. Thus far, none of the expanded screening funding has gone to the clinical services, but just for the laboratory services. And we're talking about a child with a life that needs to be cared for. And those care systems, I think, could be developed further. And as you know, that's been much of my advocacy over many years, is to try and support the care of these patients. Now, I've seen patients with 3A, B, C, and D. They are all different conditions. And even within the condition, there are early onset forms of 3A and late onset forms of 3A. So as soon as we give the information to a family, we have to continue the care system. It's not good enough for GP saying, well, oh yeah, you got 3A. I'll Google it and tell you, oh, it doesn't look very good. That's not the way that you want this kind of system to work. You want it to be run professionally, carefully, and with compassion. And that's what I would advocate for within the program that's implemented.
Thank you. That's a very important aspect, which I might come back to shortly. I might just give Enzo the opportunity to jump in there. Did you, Enzo, still wanting to add your thoughts?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, sorry, my camera doesn't seem to want to work, and I don't want to scare any children in the audience.
Okay.
Thank you for providing me with the opportunity of being on this panel. I can make the comment that one of the tenets of newborn screening is to do more good than harm. The other tenet is that just because we can, should we? Now, I would like to absolutely acknowledge the sterling work that Michael Gelb has done in this field for a decade and a half, for which he was awarded the Robert Guthrie Award in recognition of the work that he has done towards getting the ability to be able to screen for these conditions, MPS in the newborn period, the development of these substrates to enable one to measure the enzyme activity. In addition, in that same initial blood spot, to measure these glycosaminoglycans, there are phenotypic descriptors of the low attenuated enzyme activity, enables a screening for these conditions to be done with the ideal setting of no false positive or no false negatives. As such, this is a very, very good test to be able to identify the MPSs. There are a whole lot of other enzymes that Michael has developed for the other lysosomal storage disorders, but concentrating and focusing on the MPSs. The difficulty of all of this is that which has been alluded by Shanti and Kostov in regards to once you've identified these babies with these conditions when they are asymptomatic, the most ideal time to do so, you need to be able to enact a process such that you're doing more good than harm. And for instance, the condition of the type B that was removed and so forth, and these have come as a result of the treatments not being there. But this requires very clear, thorough thought through. Now, Australia, the federal government has done remarkably well, putting money where their, so to speak, their mouth is, has enabled now to do two things. Remove this postcode lottery that occurs, in that Shanti was quite correct. The screening for SMA in New South Wales started in August of 2018, and I think Carol, sitting there all by herself, will attest to the fact that SMA has only recently been started in South Australia. So this removal of postcode, absolutely essential, removing the inequity. The other is to expand newborn screening in a collective front, so that we're all doing the same things, and there is no one state that outruns the rest in terms of what's been doing. I have been afforded the opportunity of knowing and understanding the lysosomal storage disorders from my upbringing in the biochemical genetics department in South Australia. I brought those skill sets to New South Wales, where now I'm faced with 105,000 babies as opposed to the 20-odd thousand babies that need to be screened. There is no technological impediment in regards to screening for these conditions. The screening is not going to create any more new patients. They're going to identify these patients, these same patients, asymptomatic, whereupon your clinical choices become quicker, become easier to make, and you've got a timeline in order to implement. There's also another parallel universe of the use of next-gen sequencing in newborn screening. That is definitely a research undertaken by several medical research future funds that have been funded in Australia to proceed with the utilisation of next-gen sequencing. And Carol spoke briefly of the one in South Australia, Newborn in SA, of which I'm fortunate enough to be a CIA. So I think this is where we're at the moment. We can, but because we can, should we? These are now the fundamental questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Enzo. And I think you answered a question I was going to ask is, are we technically ready to introduce screening for Sanfilippo? And I think you quite clearly said yes to that one. I might just throw to one of the families, if you're willing.
Lisa,
really,
sorry to interrupt. We also have a couple of questions online from Chris as well.
Yes, I will get to those shortly. I know we're going over time and we're going to go into morning tea, but I think because we started a little bit late on this session and it's important discussion, we will keep going. So I'll come to the questions online shortly. Gillian, you're nodding. The question really from the family perspective, and I think we're getting the sense from the clinicians and the technicians that screening for conditions where there is doubt about the treatability, whether it be, clinical trial or established treatment, which we don't have yet for Sanfilippo. If you were to be diagnosed now and there is no treatment, what would be the clinical support, the social support that you would need? And then we might come back to the clinicians to see, how ready we might be for that. So if you throw yourself back, if you had found out at birth with your healthy looking babies, what do you think you would have needed in terms of going forward with that diagnosis?
I think, it would have been so comforting to have someone to explain. It would have been devastating, obviously, to have this for your seemingly healthy baby and knowing what's going to happen, but it's going to happen anyway. So to be prepared would be really beneficial, and not just, going through years and years, scratching our head, wondering why, like Sarah said, why my child is not developing the same. We know straight away. So that's been, since Rory was diagnosed, it's taken that, that edge off. So rather than constantly wondering why, I know why. So you can start to support him knowing what's going on there. So for me, the biggest thing is if Rory was diagnosed at the newborn stage, then I would have been empowered with options to have a second healthy child, which I didn't. So now I have 2 children with Sanfilippo. So I think that that's the biggest drive for me for having newborn screening, because it's not going to identify more patients, but it can prevent more from being born. So that's my drive.
And in terms of the clinical support, it's really information and proactive sort of care, proactive support for your child's needs.
Yes, so having those supports in place in terms of speech and physical therapy and whatnot already in place while before he has the symptoms, so we can have those supports there already ready to go rather than always trying to catch up would have been really beneficial.
Excellent.
Agree with that?
Thank you, Gillian. I'm going to throw that back then to the clinicians, because stuff you said the funding so far has been put into the technical aspects of the newborn screening program. What would you need? What does the clinical system need in order to, if we were to introduce screening for conditions where there isn't yet a definitive treatment, there might be clinical trials. What does the clinical system need if we're to be able to effectively support these families and not leave them with that horrible diagnosis and being sent out to sort of then try and navigate all the supports that they need independently? What do we need, and how can we work together to put those things in place?
So first I'd like to start by commending the equity of screening, but there's not equity of clinical service provision across the country. So if we're talking about Indigenous peoples, remote locations, states like Tasmania, Western Australia, with the vast expanse of territory, to deliver care across all of that needs quite a significant consideration and thought process, and that the care is delivered at the cost of the states, not of the federal government. So there's a bit of a mismatch between what kind of care can be delivered and how it's funded. So I think there's the equity of care should run in parallel with equity of testing, and ideally, and I've had sort of been in contact with an Irish metabolic service just in this week with a patient that we have, and they have roughly double the resources that we do with half the population. And so and what we would think would be needed would be social workers, psychologists, nurses, junior staff, capacity within the clinical workforce to take on clinical trials. Not every trial is successful, and some trials do cause harm. So we do have to have all of that integration in clinical services to pivot quickly from a new diagnosis into an effective clinical trial that is still an experiment. So there's quite a lot of thought process that needs to be provided into that kind of aspect of care. I think it's doable, but I think there has to be state provision of the health services, particularly mindful of Indigenous peoples and remote locations.
Thank you, because that's a very that full sort of wraparound of not just the clinical services, but the social, the genetic counsellors, etc. Really important. I know there's questions online, but I don't want to open up a massive can of worms here, Michael. But just wanted to, before we go to the questions online, just wanted to ask a question. Perhaps Michael and Edwin, you can. We can maybe have another fight offline about this, but I wanted to talk about the role for genomic newborn screening and for metabolic newborn screening. Michael has already voiced his. Well,
can I just ask Edwin a simple question, because
sure,
I think and I really want his answer. So if I understand you correctly, I'm just going to put you on the spot here, and I'm not trying to be cruel. So you're going to call out pathogenic and likely pathogenic mutations as carriers, but avoid ignore VUs. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. That's what we.
Okay.
That's the way we approach it.
So I have a question now. So the parent has a pathogenic. The father has a pathogenic mutation,
Mhm.
likely, and the mother has one. Now the kid is tested. The fetus is tested, and the genotype is pathogenic.
Yep.
So what do you do in the vast majority of cases where the penetrance is not known? So in other words, what do you do in cases where the pathogenic is late onset / late onset, and therefore for lysosomal storage diseases, most of these kids never get disease. So so the problem is the accuracy of your test is rather poor, unfortunately. So what are you going to do about late onset pathogenic / late onset pathogenic?
So the approach we used in Mackenzie's mission, which obviously had its limitations, was that we were aiming to report variant combinations that could be predicted to be associated with childhood onset disease.
Okay.
So if we saw a variant combination that was late onset, that we could reliably call that way, we would not report it.
Good. Okay. And what if you didn't know it was late on? Well, so you're ignoring VUs. That's okay.
Yep.
So now you're ignoring cases where you know it's late pathogenic. Yep. Okay, I'm good with that. So you said something very important to me. You said you're going to ignore VUs, but you're not going to ignore late onset pathogenic. Very good. Now, let me ask the newborn sequencing lady who's going to do genomics. What are you going to do for late onset in the newborn period in genomic newborn screening? What are you going to do with that case? According to Genomics England, you're going to report it out. They're going to report out all pathogenic mutations. What are you going to do with late onset pathogenic / late onset?
I think we also determine the onset. If the genotype has very clearly evidence showing it's late onset, we can, I think in that case, that is not beneficial to report it in the newborn period. We can withhold the result. But I think the real challenge is really on those less clear evidence or no clear genotype phenotype correlation, or you have a variant combination that you can't predict age of onset. Then in that case, I agree that
don't you think that's going to be the
answer?
And how many times are you going to find that, do you think? And maybe we're getting too detailed. I think it's going to be half the time you're going to have very complex cases. So you got a problem. So I would like to hear what you think, but maybe not now. But I think these complicated cases are very common.
I think that perhaps more research is needed into to how we define the genetic mutations and how we interpret the pathogenicity of them. Enzo's got his hand up, and Edwin, I think it looks like you want to say something as well.
I just wanted to very quickly comment that the Krabbe experience gives us a strong foreshadowing of what that will be like. And
Pompe, or pretty much, I believe most diseases have late onset component.
And Joe Orsini was really helpful.
I'm really, if you go ahead and ignore this problem, that's why I said I think it's going to fail. And so you have to address this problem early on. Otherwise, it will fail. That's what I said at the beginning. Now you know why. So I think it's much more complicated than calling out pathogenic, or pathogenic as carriers and pathogenic as fetus. So until you address that problem, I'm worried it's not going to work. But anyways, go ahead.
Okay, the hands are popping up now. I know we're well over time. I did open that can of worms, so I've only got myself to blame. Enzo, do you want to respond?
Yeah, you're guilty as charged. But I think the newborn in SA project, which is one of the MRFF, and if Karin is online, please Karin, come in. Carol is the clinical lead on that MRFF grant. It is absolutely unique because it combines two technologies in order to deliver a screening test. One of those technologies that provides phenotypic information is the metabolomics component. That is the information that Michael Gelb has alluded to by the measurement by mass spectrometry that enables you to measure all these different compounds, these metabolites, will go hand in hand with the next-gen sequencing or the variant analysis And the combined information is what's going to be able to provide you with the sensitivity and specificity as required. Karin, are you online? Please come in.
But Enzo, how would you bring metabolomic? You're nowhere, nobody's close to bringing metabolomics to 600 diseases on the newborn sequencing panels. So there's a big gap there, right? You agree? So
well, Michael,
yeah.
that's a research project of which that stream, newborn screening in genomics, is addressing in Australia. There were 5 grants given of the order of about $3 million. And so this is a research project which is now halfway through, and we won't know till the end. There are other groups who are now approaching newborn screening by genomics, the Genomics England, the Baby Seek and group. So they're approaching it solely by using a DNA-based method. But the system that is in South Australia, in newborn NSA, is absolutely unique. And I've been part of that, Michael. You know very well that I'm one of the chief investigators on that grant. And the metabolomics, the challenge with that is that it's producing so much information that you're now needing to resort to very high statistical analysis in order to make the interpretations. But we're on the road, Michael.
Okay, I'm going to
I look forward to that.
I've got Karen here. Karen, if you want to very briefly comment on that.
Maybe there's a comment I can offer to resolve some of the dispute in the room, which is that I think the biochemical screening and that, developing a targeted assay for a specific condition, that's a great approach forward. And Michael has shown that approach for some of the lysosomal disorders. That's not to say that, so the genomic approaches are looking at more, we're looking at over 600 conditions. We can't validate the genomic assay for each one of those conditions to the same level you can validate a targeted assay. So the genomic screen is going in really broad, picking up the low-hanging fruit, the very clear, we can predict the disease phenotype, and we will be cautious in reporting the ones where we're not certain. Whereas
very good.
We can have targeted approaches, and we're trying to combine some of that in some of the research that is ongoing. But these approaches are not at conflict with each other, and they offer different opportunities.
I think that is exactly our project is doing. It is the multi-omic approach for the newborn screening that is combining the genomics and the metabolomics, which will give us the biochemical phenotypic data to assist the interpretation of the genomic variants.
Yes, I think that's quite an exciting prospect, I think, to be able to use those things in combination and try and establish this.
If I can just say something, if you guys if you say that you will call out the low-hanging fruit, the cases where the penetrance is well known or highly predictable, I'm okay with that. Your false negative rate will be high. I'm okay with that because you're screening for 600 diseases that we're not screening for now. So even if you catch half of them, I'm okay with that. The key for me is that you don't call out all pathogenic genotypes. If you do that, you will fail. And I think you agree.
Thank you. It sounds like we're generally in agreement. I open that can of worms, and we've really run out of time. I know, so I'm really sorry there are questions online, and we can continue this discussion in the room to a certain extent, but I think we're going to have to call it. Is there a really quick question, do you think, or one that really should be asked, or have we covered most of it?
Yeah, Chris is online and we've given her the ability to ask them herself. Chris, are they quick questions, do you think?
One of them's been answered. The other one, I was just wanting to acknowledge the voice of the community and the support for newborn screening, even in the absence of a treatment. And I wanted to ask, how can we acknowledge that support and the attitudes of families who are actually in this position? And do we need more attitude studies or public consultations to try and move towards screening for treatments, even if they don't have, for conditions, even if they don't have a treatment?
Thanks, Chris. I think maybe perhaps Edwin or Carol, you could, in terms of the newborn screen, the genomic newborn screening studies that are going on at the moment, are those attitude studies in place? Are they part of that research that's ongoing?
Yes, definitely. Our study has the stakeholder engagement to explore the attitude of the mainly it's the patient group parents, and then we have interviewed with our prospective parents, and then it recruited through Women and Children Hospital about their view on the genes, and then how the genomic newborn screening, their attitude, and how they look at the test, and then in terms of result return, how would they feel, and then whether our proposed material is supportive enough for them to understand the screening. So that part at least is done on our study. And then worldwide, I think most of the study would have this part of stakeholder engagement. The two studies I mentioned in my presentation are from the VCGS group, and Edwin's presentation also mentioned even in the reproductive care screening, the ethics, and then the stakeholder engagement part, it is one of the important arm of the research project. Definitely for a screening program for a population, we need the public to be on board to accept the screening. That is the first step to have a successful screening program.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to thank all of the panelists. I know this is a discussion that could go on for a very long time, and we're running out of time. We've run out of time. Thank you, Enzo. Thank you, Gustav, Shanti, Michael. Thank you for joining us from Seattle, and Edwin. Thank you very much, Carol, for being our woman in the room, and to families who contributed as well. It was a very interesting discussion. Lots more work to be done, but I think we've sort of unearthed some of the things that we still need to work on, and really appreciate you all giving up your time. Thank you very much.
Welcome to the next session entitled Stop, Treating Sanfilippo at its Root Cause. My name is Emma Parkinson Lawrence, and I'm from the University of South Australia, and together with my colleague and friend Sandy Orgeig run a program looking at lung health in Sanfilippo syndrome and also Hurler syndrome. So just where I'm from, and it's wonderful to see some of you that I did meet last year, and I look forward to catching up with you later on. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Lisa Melton. Dr. Melton is Head of Research at the Sanfilippo Children's Foundation, and she has a PhD in neuroscience and over 20 years of experience in research management and research communication. At the foundation, she supports a research program and collaborations with families, patient organisations, researchers, clinicians and industry, both nationally and internationally. And I know from personal experience that she's an amazing person. And Lisa's going to talk to us today about an international Sanfilippo Syndrome Alliance proposal for a research platform.
Thank you very much, Emma. Sorry, you've got me again in front of you, but this you won't see so much of me after this presentation. I'm not so much talking about stop as research that's going to stop the disease, but I wanted to really quickly introduce you to something that we're working on through the International Sanfilippo Syndrome Alliance to try and solve one of the enablers of research that was identified in the roadmap. So I think most of you probably remember seeing this diagram last year when I presented on the global roadmap for Sanfilippo syndrome therapies. And in that roadmap, we identified pillars of research that are needed in order to accelerate progress towards therapies. But underpinning those pillars of research are some elements that are will actually accelerate and enable all of the research. And you know, in the diagram, you can see that we've got the research flowing from better understanding, and then we get to treatments, and then we can get clinical trials underway, and then we can make the therapies accessible. I think we all know that research doesn't work in that very linear fashion. It is an iterative process, and each angle of research, each pillar of research informs the other pillars. And to make that happen better and faster, to make those pillars of research inform each other and to accelerate progress, we identified that more patient data was needed in Sanfilippo syndrome ecosystem so that we can connect the dots and join all those pieces of research together. So
collaboration, bringing data together, linking existing data sets and gathering new data about patients were all parts of that enabling idea. And linking data together is being worked on by our colleagues at Cure Sanfilippo Foundation, who are working to connect all of the clinical trial and natural history study data sets together, so that the power of that analysis can be applied to research across the board. But we also identified the need for gathering ongoing data, and we wanted to look at how we could best do that. We started at this process thinking about the idea of a registry, a patient registry, and gathering ongoing data from patients, from their clinicians, and pooling all that data together. I'm going to sort of perhaps use the word registry a bit less than we sort of thought about in the beginning, as a registry may not be the only solution to what we're doing here. So what we have undertaken is a scoping project to say, is a registry needed? If so, what should it look like? How should it function? How do we solve the problems? What could a registry solve, and how do we solve those problems through gathering patient data? So we engaged with some consultants to help us do this. Some very expert researcher who's worked in registries for a long time is helping us with this project. And what we wanted to do was gather information from the Sanfilippo community, the whole ecosystem, clinicians, researchers, patients, industry, patient organizations, to see what do we need and what might the best model look like. And the reason for presenting it to you here today is really just to start the cogs turning in your own minds about how such data could help research, how we could contribute to this, which parts of our community here in Australia and people listening online, how that they can contribute to solving some of these questions that have arisen in this scoping study. So we undertook some, so I say we, this is with our consultants, interviewed key opinion leaders, and then from those, the answers in those key opinion leader interviews, there was also a bigger survey developed that went out to a wider network of stakeholders in the Sanfilippo community. And we also held a meeting in Germany at the International MPS Society conference, where we had stakeholders in the room, and we talked about these ideas and gathered more information from those discussions as well. So the interviews, as I say, researchers, clinicians, patient organisations, 14 people across multiple continents, and then that moved on to the survey, which 97 stakeholders were invited to participate in that survey. We got a 34% response rate, and again, they included a broad spectrum of clinicians, researchers, patients, industry from USA, Australia, UK, Europe, South America. And the clinicians and researchers that responded to the survey were very well established clinicians and researchers as well, who'd been in the field for a long time, which I think was really beneficial to get those views. I really want to go quick because I want to try and make up a little bit of time. But so the results of this survey showed really strong support for a registry or a data gathering platform of some type, with a focus purely on Sanfilippo syndrome. So one of the big questions is, do we pull together? Do we work with other conditions? And there are registries that already exist that gather data across multiple different conditions. But the sense that we got in this survey is that there is a need just to really focus in on Sanfilippo syndrome, that the issues affecting the Sanfilippo research pipeline are then they're common to other conditions as well, but to really narrow it down and to not get lost in other details and other conditions, to keep it focused on Sanfilippo. It was slightly biased because we were asking the Sanfilippo community, but that's where it landed. There was a general consensus that we needed to be collecting data from clinicians who look after patients, so clinical data, but also patient-reported data, data that is contributed into the study by families and their children. But there is a recognition that getting really good quality clinical data is going to require a dedicated effort, and you can't just sort of gather that kind of quality data from existing medical records. when people were asked about what could we get out of this, what would it be most useful for, the three things that floated to the top were using the data from as control arms. So we call it natural history study is a study of the natural course of the disease, the symptoms, the physical features, the characteristics of the disease, and how it progresses over time in an untreated condition. And so those studies are used in clinical trials for rare disease as a control arm to compare against the treatment. So we need that data. There is existing data out there, but we need more of that data that was identified in here. And to help support clinical management and the development of clinical guidelines as well. So those were, there's other uses of that would come out of the data, but those were the top ideas. As I mentioned, natural history data was really strongly identified in there, but there was a strong sense from the interviews with the stakeholders and from the comments in the survey that this is going to require a dedicated study of expert clinical centres where the quality of the data and the commitment to keep putting that data in is going to be really strong. So it wouldn't necessarily just come out of just a standard registry. It would require a dedicated commitment. The types of data that could be collected, the opinions around that were quite consensus around you want general information about the condition, the demographics, the age of onset and so on, genetic information, clinical information, including scans and blood tests, function and behavior of the patients, and also health economic data. And there's also a sense that we should also be collecting digital data. So from things like wearables, sensor that is required, doesn't require input by a person typing stuff into a computer, but is gathered from, your wrist or other types of data gathering. When it came to the operation of this data platform or registry, there was a very strong sense that the Sanfilippo community should be in charge of this, that should look after the governance, the recruitment and communication, and that operational management, data analysis and so on could be provided by a professional third-party provider who have the skills and the infrastructure to do that. So it would be, but the Sanfilippo patient community would be in the driving seat and looking after the data. There was agreement that industry should and could be involved, but that they should not have a decision-making role. They shouldn't be able to determine what studies are done and what data is gathered, but they can collaborate with the study. Lots and lots of challenges were identified about such a registry or data collection platform. It's going to be expensive, need to ensure the independence of the work and the research, time constraints for people inputting data, that includes parents and clinicians, confidentiality around the data, and ensuring quality of the data. But there were also solutions offered to these challenges as well. So, for example, about the independence, we would seek funding from multiple different sources rather than relying on one single industry player, for example, to fund the endeavour. Making sure that the data that's gathered is interoperable, that it can be shared with other sources of data and co-analysed with other sources of data. Having a clear rationale and protocols and frameworks in place from the beginning, taking advice from the drug regulatory bodies, EMA and FDA and so on, about what to collect and how best to collect it so that the data we do gather has the most utility when it comes to drug approvals and clinical trials and so on. And demonstrating the benefits to clinicians and caregivers from the start so that they stay engaged and keep contributing. So there were lots of interesting ideas and solutions. So just to quickly summarize, the sense is that there is an appetite and a need for a registry or a data gathering dedicated to Sanfilippo, that natural history could be a big focus of that, gathering more natural history data, that we should involve both patients and clinicians. But there's still work to be done on exactly what data would be gathered and how. So there were multiple different potential solutions to solve some of these challenges around data. And with the consultants and with the Alliance team, we are continuing to investigate this. But I just really wanted to throw it out here today to let you know what we're doing, to let you know what direction we're trying to go in. And I'm open to thought. I'm happy to chat. I know we haven't got a lot of time for questions. I can take a couple of questions, but really to start the conversation, to get you thinking about how this could benefit your research and how you could help and contribute, and how we might be able to take this forward and gather the data that we need. So that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. Okay, maybe just a couple of questions and or comments, and Kim. Thanks, Lisa. There's already natural history study data out there for some of the Sanfilippo subtypes. Are you going to be able to get access to that? Because it's a very valuable resource, and it would be nice to incorporate it with any new data to make the most out of the contributions those patients have already made.
Yes, absolutely right. So as I mentioned, Cure Sanfilippo Foundation in the USA have already initiated a project to try and gather and pool in or federate that data so that it already exists in natural history studies, the natural history studies that have already been done, that are part of clinical trials. A lot of the industry players did their own natural history studies before starting clinical trials, and some of that is sequestered away. And so the project that Cure Sanfilippo are doing with the support of us and the others in the Alliance is to try and pull that data, to get access to that data and be able to analyze it together. So then, yes, if we continue to collect more natural history study data, it would be the plan is to make sure it's as interoperable and that can be shared and co-analyzed and used to really boost the quality of data and the quantity of data to make it as convincing as possible for regulators. So yes, that would absolutely need to be part of the solution.
Anyone else? Anyone online? No? I just had one quick question. On one of your graphs, there looked to be quite a few that disagreed. Yes.
This one?
Yeah. And I just wondered.
I didn't go through that in detail. There's so the one in the middle, the one in the middle is the one that I like best, because that's a register should have an equal focus on both patient reported and medical record data collection. So everybody was in agreement, apart from maybe one person, that we should be collecting both patient reported and clinical data. When the other questions are sort of flipped that around a little bit. So for the third one down, collection of routine medical record data in a registry will be sufficient quality to support high quality research into natural history. So that was where people did not agree with that we would need to do a dedicated natural history study embedded within a bigger study potentially to get the quality that we would need. So there was sort of quibbles around some of the way we would do it and some of the type of data we'd collect. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay.
Anyone else? No, well, in the interest of time, thank you very much, Lisa.
Thank you.
And can I now call upon some of our expert colleagues here in the audience who you've heard from today, because we'd like to open up this discussion a little bit further. Can I ask Kim Yahui and Adeline to come to the podium, please? And I'm going to pose the big question to our experts as they find their seats. I think the question on all of our lips, certainly the question on those of families and clinicians such as myself who are at the end of this, often very complex and pathway of drug development. But how can we utilize data such as this and programs such as this to ultimately drive drug treatments to patients?
Thanks, Nick. It's a good question. I mean, people have been working on Sanfilippo for, as I was discussing with Sharon earlier, for 20 plus years since the animal models started appearing. But I think what's changed in the last little while, and I'm hoping this is an experience around the world, not just here in Australia, is that we're collaborating more. So I think having scientists work beavering away in their labs is not going to translate a therapy. Clinicians working with patients is not going to translate a therapy. The absence until Meg Mack set up the Sanfilippo Children's Foundation, the absence of really good patient support organisations is not going to create a therapy. But if you bring all of those three things together, and if you involve industry, if that's at all possible, that's going to create a translatable therapy. And I think that's what we're starting to do more. So we're here today as a group. I think more and more we're actually coming up with projects collectively, collaboratively, interacting with each other all the way through. And I think what that is going to do, as is illustrated by the project we've just heard about, is hopefully hasten the translation, because you've involved everybody right from the get-go. So I think, if there's projects going on in labs in Adelaide, in Australia, or beyond that aren't involving the families, the patient support organisations, or clinical people at the coalface with patients, then I think that needs to be remedied, and they need to find those partners, because that is going to hasten things. Just those people together are not going to actually move something into a clinical trial. Of course, we need money, because they're very expensive things to do. So that's going to require some creative thinking, either company involvement, maybe government funding, because there are clinical trial supports that are available. For instance, here in Australia, there's MRFF funding for establishing clinical trials. And so we need to be thinking ahead as we're doing the work in the lab to what's the next step to get this into a patient trial.
I just want to say I definitely echo Kim's sentiments in terms of a much larger collaboration across multiple groups between researchers, clinicians, the patient advocacy groups, as well as the patients themselves, and also possibly industry if we can. And I think that will definitely really drive forward the translation of our work from the lab to the clinic for the patients.
Do we have any questions for the panel from the audience? While they're thinking, I have one for the panel, and I'd be interested to know what your thoughts are, because I agree completely with Kim's position and thoughts on how we can drive research from the bench to the bedside. What about the value of cross-pollination between similar diseases and diseases that may have common mechanisms? And that's something that, in my observation, has not been a focus previously, or at least at a high level focus. Is there a comment from the panel on that?
I think Yahoo is a great example of exactly that. Tony Cook is another great example of exactly that. People setting out to have a lead disease based on their own experience, but with the view and involving people with experience in other diseases right from the start. So
yeah, I was just going to say, in terms of things like gene therapy, where we can very easily do a plug and play swap over of genes, this is where we can definitely see cross-pollination across multiple diseases, collaboration across different diseases with people with expertise in different disease models to then drive forward and testing the therapeutic efficacy of these in preclinical models to then go into clinical trials.
And Lisa's in the audience. Could I take that concept further, Lisa, and ask you to comment on how that cross-pollination and collaborative approach works at the patient and family level, and indeed at the advocacy level?
Certainly at the advocacy level, we are trying to do more and more of working with like-minded patient organisations, both within Australia and internationally. So you've heard about us working with the International Sanfilippo Syndrome Alliance. There's also an alliance of alliances developing, which they had an inaugural meeting at the World Symposium, the Lysosomal Disease Symposium in San Diego, which is an alliance of patient organisation, of international alliances of patient organisations from covering different types of lysosomal diseases. So I think from those types of things happening, we'll see more cross-contamination, or not contamination is the wrong word, sorry, cross-fertilisation of ideas and collaboration. We're looking at ways of work, so certainly with other patient organisations in Australia, Batten disease, Niemann-Pick, mitochondrial disease, we talk regularly. We are sharing ideas and trying to work on projects together that are stimulating research, particularly around symptom management that are common across some of these diseases as well. So it's something that we're trying to do more of. Funding models are challenging. All of us have limited resources, but I think working together to work on some of the bigger government funding opportunities as collective groups of diseases is something that's hopefully will pay dividends in the future as well. Does that answer that question?
I think, yeah, thank you, Lisa. I think it's most insightful comments, and I would perhaps even take that one step further to the panel and to the audience to think about how we work with our colleagues who are investigating similar diseases within the adult population and adult dementias, and how that information increasingly is of value to the childhood dementias and Sanfilippo syndrome specifically, and indeed. I'm aware that there is discussion on that at this meeting, at this current meeting, which is an exemplar of how that collaboration can really drive research forward. We've got a couple of minutes, and if I could perhaps leave this question with the panel, or first just check if anyone else in the audience had any questions for the panel. I'd ask the panel to perhaps go out on a limb and tell us how they feel, or what they feel are the biggest limitations to driving therapies from the lab to the patient that we face in the next 5 years.
Well, personally, I think the biggest challenge that we are facing is funding. Without funding, we are not able to then drive the research. And I think that's super important. And I think it has been fantastic to see a lot of the patient advocacy groups doing fundraising to get funding to continue research, to drive that forward, hopefully into clinical trials from preclinical research.
I think for me, funding would be number one as well. But the other thing is we need strong clinical partners such as yourself. And while you're amazing, you're only one person with only a limited amount of time. So we need to be able to find more experts that are able to take on these projects to give their advice and for us to consult with. Because if we have all these great ideas, but they're not translationally feasible, we need to know that early so we're not wasting our time and research dollars developing therapies that will never get into the clinic. So
I agree with you both, but I would also add the number of patients. As there's increased numbers of trials, finding patients for new approaches is going to become harder and harder. And that's where people like NICS, national and international clinical networks are absolutely invaluable. It's not going to be possible, I don't think, to do clinical trials that are just in Australia. It's going to have to be an international, very coordinated approach.
Thank you. Well, if I could thank the panel and all the speakers from this current session today for their most informative views. Many thanks.